On November 10th, 2020, patch 10.23 was implemented into League, and with it came the heavily anticipated item system rework, fully reimagining a core part of the game's experience through a total overhaul of virtually every item in the shop, along with introducing a new tier of items known as mythics, items that were intended to be purchased early on that would shape how that champion will play out for the rest of the game. Many of us dove into this patch with some trepidation, but the overall consensus toward the mythic item system was positive, since at the time, the game was becoming exhaustively stale and it was high time for some major changes to take place to shake things up. As players began to experiment with and enjoy the new items and all the stuff that was introduced and/or reworked, it was discovered almost immediately that one category of mythics was performing significantly better than the others: the tank mythics, Sunfire Aegis, Turbo Chem Tank, and Frostfire Gauntlet. As always, Riot was quick to hotfix them to be less overbearing, slashing their damage numbers and supplementary effects. While that was helpful in toning down the relative strength of tank mythics, the better part of preseason and early season 11 was characterized by the abuse of these tank items, both from champions who were intended to build them and those who weren't. It didn't take long until more definitive nerfs were hammered on them, effectively gutting the entire tank class for the majority of seasons 11 and 12 before the durability update. This wasn't the first time the tank class experienced a moment of glory before being shut down altogether, and it wasn't the last either. Just recently we experienced a surge of popularity once more thanks to two of the three new tank items, Jockshell the Protean and Heartsteel, and in typical fashion these items received rather substantial nerfs, along with some of their beneficiaries suffering the same fate. Out of all the classes in this game, tanks appeared to receive a disproportionately faster response towards any semblance of dominance, preventing them from ever being able to find lasting relevance throughout a season. While this is mostly a theory, I believe this pattern of occurrence can be explained by looking back in time to a period where tanks had quite possibly the longest stretch of competitive dominance we've ever seen. For today, I want to go through the history of Season 5 through 7's tank meta, and how it cripples the tank class even to this day. For those who might be a little confused as to what I mean by tanks never being allowed to be relevant, the ever-changing nature of League causes metas to shift every so often, sometimes lasting 3 to 4 months, half a year, or in extreme cases an entire season. For example, the mythic item system brought with it a stream of mini-metas where one item was frequently exploited until it got nerfed. We had the Stridebreaker meta, the Moonstone Renewer meta, the Turbo Chem Tank meta, the Gore Drinker meta, stuff like that. Metas are, of course, not endemic to just items. It can also be a class, like Enchanter meta, Bruiser meta, Assassin meta, what have you. Or something even smaller like the Teleport meta or Kleptomancy meta. Ever since I would say Season 10, metas never last more than 6 months at worst. Whenever something overperforms, the balance team tends to keep a close eye on things so as to prevent anything from becoming tier 0, but that wasn't always the case. If you were to ask anyone what their first memory of Seasons 5, 6, and 7 is, there might be a few who talk about the class reworks such as the Marksman, Mage, Assassin, Juggernaut update, or some who mention the Elemental Dragons, or Plants maybe, but the answer you'll likely receive the most is the infamous tank meta. While I wouldn't say it ever achieved tier 0 status in the same fashion as the likes of say Ardent Censer or Black Cleaver, tank meta arguably had more significance from a historical perspective, mainly due to how long it lasted, the factors that coalesced to form it in the first place, and how present it was through all levels of play, from low elo such as Bronze, Silver, and Gold, to the upper echelons of Master and Challenger, and even in Pro Play. A quick search on YouTube for tank meta and you'll find videos after videos about tanks doing more damage than carries, non-tank champions going full tank in 1v9 in games, moments where top jungle support, sometimes even mid laners going tank, the list goes on and on. It's almost become a meme where anytime there's an update buffing tanks or tank items, players freak out about the possibility of another tank meta, painting just how much impact it had on the game ever since then. It's hard to pinpoint exactly when tank meta started, but for me, I would say it began in version 5.5. The jungle item Juggernaut was removed and replaced with Cinderhulk, the jungler's equivalent of Sunfire Cape way back when. In its inception, the item cost a total of 2200 gold in exchange for granting 350 flat health, 25% bonus health, and the usual Sunfire burning effect. Let that sink in for a moment. 350 flat health is not a whole lot all things considered, it's the 25% bonus health that should get your attention. See, by 2 items, most tanks would have around 2500 HP back then, so a quarter of that would mean 625 bonus health, and then as you get your 3rd, 4th, and 5th item, that bonus would get even bigger. So by 4000, for a measly price of 2200 gold, Cinderhulk would grant you 1350 health. Granted, that's all it really did, but this much health afforded the luxury of being able to itemize into dedicated tank items like Frozen Heart back then, allowing for tanks to achieve monstrous amounts of durability. This allowed for several junglers like Sejuani, Zac, Old Nunu, Gragas and whatnot to get really beefy, and back then, tanks used to have a lot of base damage to account for them not getting any extra as time went on, along with most if not all tanks having access to percent health damage while non-tank champions rarely did. That was roughly where I would say we started tank meta, but things came to a head at the beginning of Season 6, where we would have access to the new Keystone Masteries, and with it, Grasp of the Undying, which is almost identical to the Grasp of the Undying Keystone rune we have right now. This allowed tanks the ability to convert their health into meaningful damage so long as they remained in combat. Tank meta was officially underway. The buffs to Sunfire Keep in versions 5.22, 6.1, and 6.3 made it an extremely gold efficient item, and with Iceborne Gauntlet being reworked into an armor item giving 65 armor, 20% CDR, and a slow radius to scale with armor, tanks now had access to a very solid 2-item power spike that gave a huge amount of health, armor, mana, cooldown reduction, and most importantly, damage. The combination of Grasp of the Undying, Iceborne Spellblade passive, and Sunfire or cinderhulk's Burning Aura gave tanks a massive upgrade in DPS, without forfeiting any defense whatsoever. Throughout Season 6, the top lane tanks like Shen, Poppy, Nautilus, Maokai, Tahm Kench, and Malphite would build those 2 items and begin to start tearing through ADCs and bruisers left and right. They didn't necessarily one-shot them, but the sheer amount of survivability meant they would last through several rotations of their abilities, since at the time, tank shredding options were few and far between. By the mid-game, once they got their hands on Spear Visage, it became virtually impossible to take these guys on unless you were playing someone who explicitly specialized in shutting down tanks like Vayne or Fiora. Even then, that's assuming they wouldn't kill you first.
Very, very close game, but TSM are eking these small edges.
Yeah,
wow, Hansel.
Yeah, I mean, oh, and he stops it down.
Brutalizing Huni right now. Again, just shade stunning him, dear lord! Hanser smashes Huni!
Most junglers also defaulted to going full tank as well, taking advantage of Cinderhulk combined with the new tank items like Dead Man's Plate to serve as auxiliary frontliners. Even bruisers like Rek'Sai, Olaf, and Lee Sin would run full tank. Interestingly, tank meta persisted all the way through Season 6 without any significant nerfs. Iceborne lost a bit of effectiveness in 6.4 and 6.8, but not enough to hinder its efficiency. Sunfire Cape basically got away with murder, only gaining a 200 higher gold cost. Otherwise, that's how things ran. It became so prominent that you would see assassins and skirmishers dabble in this as well. Fizz, Echo, Nidalee, and Akali were frequent bandwagoners on Sunfire Iceborne, and in solo queue you would see random champions go full tank because they could. With that much durability and healing, you could just sit back and let your base damage plus Sunfire plus Iceborne plus Grasp do all the work. Seeing as how tanks were ultimately still reliant on carries to back them up, Riot didn't see them as too troublesome. So aside from a couple slaps on the wrist for the ones who were enjoying tank meta too much, none of the tanks were penalized all too badly. It's the non-tanks that needed to be addressed, like Echo and Fizz. Fortunately, the Assassin update coincided with Pre-Season 7, which worked out nicely, placing the spotlight on the newfangled edgy boys and girls running amok on the Rift. But what ended up happening is that it took attention away from tanks, who were still performing extremely well. Not just the Assassin update, the class-wide reworks from Marksman in Pre-Season 6, and the mid-season update reworking mages in Season 6, followed by the Assassin update in Pre-Season 7, made it so that there was always something else going on. Obviously, with the contentious reputation assassins have, they would most definitely be the target of everyone's animosity, although one could say it was a worthwhile trade-off if it meant you no longer had to deal with Akali, Fizz, Echo, and Nidalee running you down while being invincible. Tanks were still large though, both the champions and items. There were 3 key reasons behind tank meta being such a disturbance for players. The first was the items. Back then, tank items were to all-purpose. If you look at tank items now, they're purposely specified to address something. You took Thornmail for healers or rapid auto attackers, Randuin's you took for crit damage users, Spear Visage you took for increased healing and shielding, Force of Nature you took for hyper magic damage teams. Tank items back in Season 6 and 7, however, were far more general. Granted, they still had their own distinct functions, but take Spear Visage for example. Right now, it has 450 health, 10 ability haste, 100% health regen bonus, and 50 magic resist. During Season 6, it had 500 health, 55 magic resist, 10% CDR, and 200% health regeneration, which would become 250% thanks to its own 25% healing amp. It didn't boost the power of shields back then, but even for tanks who didn't have any healing, the base stats were just phenomenal. So we had 50 MR versus 55, 10 ability haste versus 10% CDR, 450 health versus 500, 100% health regen versus 200%, current Visage is 2900 gold, Visage back then was 28. Of course, current Visage makes up for that by also boosting shielding power as well as healing, but that's if your champion has both healing and shielding. This applied to every other tank item as well. Sunfire gave 500 health and 50 armor, Randuin's gave 500 health and 60 armor. Every tank item back then was useful for a broad range of situations because more value was tied to the base stats, not so much the passives, although they did matter. Second, tank busting measures were few and far between. Lot less % health damage, true damage, and armor shred in terms of champions and items. I touched on this in my Toxic Metas video a while back, but did you guys notice how ever since around Season 6 when tank meta started, there's been a lot more % health damage and true damage coming in? Jhin was the first champion in Season 6, and his passive does missing health. Then we have Kled who does max health, Camille who does % health and true damage, Kayn with % health if he goes red form, Ornn with % health damage, Zoe with true damage, Kai'Sa with % missing health, Pyke's is an execute, which is basically true damage. I don't think the increase in frequency was coincidental. Not only that, but they brought in a lot of new tank busting items thereafter, which became even more plentiful following the mythic item system. Systems were also adjusted to be more anti-tank. For example, we have the cut down rune, which is designed to deal with tanks. Conqueror also used to convert a portion of damage dealt into true damage. They actually reverted that change purely because tanks were getting absolutely demolished by anyone who ran it. Third, tanks were just broken, like actually broken. You look at the base damage and effects they had back in the day compared to now, it's almost insane how strong they were back then. That may sound extremely strange considering how much damage tanks are doing right now, but the relativity was more noticeable. Presently, tanks are doing a metric ton of damage because that was a response to there being too much damage, so they had to make tanks deal a lot of damage, otherwise it would all suck. Back then, however, base damage on every class was quite low, while on tanks they were decently high. You'll notice how champions like Gragas and Maokai used to run full tank, whereas now they go full AP. Riot slashed a lot of their base numbers and pumped up their AP ratios to incentivize players to go AP on them. So overall, it was a combination of overpowered items, lack of countermeasures, and a bigger disparity in base parameters that made tanks the reigning class for so long. In fairness though, Seasons 5 through 7 was a huge turning point for League, ushering in a new era of the game through class updates, champion reworks, new champions, and whatnot. As a result, many of us assumed this was merely growing pains that Riot had to work out. But things reached an all-time breaking point when Ornn was released, as he fully highlighted all of the aforementioned factors behind the absurdity of tank meta. Even though the concept of 200 years didn't come out until a few years later, Ornn was likely the first instance of a champion that personified the 200 years meme.
Because Ornn, the Mage, Death Knight, Paladin, Hunter, Rogue, Warrior, Enchanter, Tank, Bruiser, Wizard, Warlock, Priest, Assassin, Gunslinger, Druid, Shaman, Necromancer, Ninja, Gunslinger, Bard, Monk, Robot, Conjurer, Blacksmith, Mystic, Warden, God, Illusionist, Templar, Wizard was able to take up so much damage and give Dragon X the opening that they needed.
Exaggerated of course, but then again, Ornn had damage, tankiness, crowd control, engage, peel, dueling potential, burst trades, all-ins, wave clear, neutral game, sustain, split pushing, team fights. He was so overloaded, it was inconceivable as to how he made it to live servers without someone giving it a second thought. Ornn's release also took place shortly after the mid-season 7 Vanguard update, placing heavy emphasis on Maokai, Zac, and Sejuani. Despite all the videos, memes, clips, and discourse about tanks, they were still flying under the radar, at least until that point. From then on, the damage meta we've been in ever since came to be. Tanks got nerfed, tank items got nerfed, damage items were buffed, carry champions were buffed, more champions with inherent tank busting came out, and the rest is history. Attempts have been made in the past to try and bring tanks back into meta relevance, but if and when they happened, it would last for all but a momentary spark. While bruisers, mages, or assassins have enjoyed long stretches of dominance, tanks, whether as a class or individuals, would barely make it through 1 month before ultimately getting shut down. There will never be another period where a large group of tanks are in control of the meta. Perhaps 1 or 2 might have some fun, but never what we experienced during 2015 to 2017. The tolerance of this kind of gameplay environment runs on such a shorter fuse nowadays, and sentiment towards that philosophy is a bit of a mixed bag. The benefit of long-lasting metas back then was that it offered some semblance of permanence, as in it was worth investing time into X or Y champions since one could assume that champion would be strong for quite some time. Moreover, provided I remember correctly, the ensuing consequences were arguably far more toxic in terms of experience. Sure, many players were frustrated that tanks were extremely difficult to stop, but the side effect of that was games were slower. Mistakes made early on weren't as match deciding as they are now. Furthermore, because of the sheer overinflation of damage, tanks are even more absurdly overstated now than they were before, and still getting shredded to bits depending on the team composition. Tanks were too tanky, so they made tank busting options more plentiful, but then there was too much damage, so they tried to make tanks extra tanky to compensate. But the thing about tank busting is, it doesn't matter how tanky those champions get, tank busting is still tank busting, leaving only one option: increasing the amount of damage tanks can do through set items to compete with carries. But if tank items do a lot of damage on top of being durable, that poses the risk of non-tank champions abusing them. Basically, you're stuck in a catch-22. If you make tanks strong, they inadvertently make other champions strong as well, but if you make tanks weak, no one wants to play them. Even if you opted for a more durability-focused approach to items and systems, like how they did with the new mythic items, they will never be contained within the tank class. Everyone who can abuse them will abuse them because in League, the best offense is a strong defense. The longer you stay alive, the more damage you'll do, the more ability rotations you'll go through, so on and so forth. Season 5 through 7's tank meta is why the tank class is permanently crippled. They may have a few weeks of prominence every now and then, but I have a feeling we're never going to leave the Fighter Slayer Mage Hyper Carry meta. The alternative would just be way worse. That being said, I really do miss tank meta, not because I play tanks, not entirely anyway. I just feel like games were more stable back then. We didn't have teams full of 1v9 champions egoing over who has the biggest stick size.
I know your type, Draven. The kind of man who's compensating for something.
I hope this was insightful for you guys, a bit of a different video than what I would normally make, but I had a fun time writing this. If you enjoyed as well, it would be awesome if you could leave a like and subscribe to the channel, really helps me out. Also follow me on Twitter at Vars, join my Discord server, and check out my video on toxic metas if you want some more history type content. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon in the next one. Take care.